Hello, Nutrition 430. Today we're going to talk about the integration and regulation of metabolism and then the impact of exercise in sport. So we'll start off here by talking about the interrelationship of carbs, lipid, and protein metabolism. Any of these nutrients can fuel the body in the short term. Of course, we have the TCA cycle, which is an amphibolic pathway, which means that it can be anabolic or catabolic. For example, we have lipogenesis. So carbohydrate spares lipolysis and promotes gain. Glucose is a precursor for glycerol and for fatty acids. So anything we eat in excess, including carbs and including protein and including fat, can be turned into fat in the long term. We also have gluconeogenesis. So the glycerol portion is only from fat. The fatty acids with odd numbers of carbon atoms, as well as the glucogenic amino acids, can all go through the process of gluconeogenesis, creating some glucose molecules out of these glycerol, fatty acid, or amino acid substrates. And then in addition, we can also convert energy nutrients that favor lipogenesis. So when we look at, if we're consuming too much of anything as related to our EER, it can be converted to fat pretty easily unless we're really encouraging, muscle synthesis or protein synthesis through some targeted exercise. We also have the TCA cycle and electron transport chain that are common to all three, are common to carbohydrate and protein and fat, catabolism. This catabolic pathway is also going to produce carbon dioxide for carboxylation, carbon for some other needs, provide some common intermediates, and provide citrate and malate, which then can be used for lipogenesis, which we'll learn about a little bit more in the second part of the semester when we talk about fats. And so just as a little review of the interrelationships here, we can see we have glycolysis heading this way, right, which then can head into citric acid cycle and electron transport chain. We have fatty acids, which can be converted to acetyl-CoA and then head into the citric acid cycle. Same with amino acids. And then we also have, the glycerol backbones of those fatty acids and certain amino acids that then can head through that gluconeogenesis process as well. So we're constantly creating these anabolic and catabolic pathways through, the TCA cycle and gluconeogenesis and protein synthesis and fatty acid synthesis or lipogenesis there. We also have the liver, which plays a real central role in metabolism. So it acts as a key processor and distributor. It's going to be important for creation of glycogen and breakdown of glycogen. About a quarter of our glycogen is in the liver. It's also important for protein synthesis, catabolism, and conversion of proteins to other compounds that contain nitrogen, as well as lipoprotein synthesis. So a lot of this starting material is really created by the liver and controlled by the liver. We also have, in our fed and fasted cycle, just very tissue-specific metabolism. So our fed state is going to be in the 3 hours after the meal. Our post-absorptive or early fasting state is somewhere between 3 to 12 to 18 hours after a meal. So a lot of us really only are in this state, after dinner and before breakfast when we're sleeping. When we look at the fasting state, this is going to be between 18 hours to 2 days when nothing else has been eaten. And then a long-term fast is fully adapted to deprivation, which is, weeks along the way. And in different stages of the fed-fast cycle, we have very different key metabolic factors at play. So as we can see here, in the fed state, typically we're going to be in an anabolic state. So we have glucose converted to glycogen and fatty acids. Glucose is going to be used by nervous cells, red blood cells, adipocytes, muscle tissue. In the post-absorptive state, we're going to have some glycogenolysis taking place, so glycogen breakdown both in the muscle and from the liver, as well as some gluconeogenesis, so those amino acids as well as some fatty acids, glycerol backbones are going to be converted into glucose as well. Then in the fasting state, we're going to say that typically, we can see that gluconeogenesis is going to be performed at a higher rate, as well as ketone formation will start to occur when there's no carbohydrate available and fat needs to be used in order to provide some additional energy. Then in that starvation state, the fatty acids are used to a greater extent. The glycerol becomes the major glucose source and then is converted to glucose through gluconeogenesis. And then ketosis will occur after the oxaloacetate is fully depleted. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more, the metabolism of all of this, when we get to amino acid metabolism as well as fatty acid metabolism. So when we look at amino acid metabolism in the fed state, amino acids are used for proteins or they're broken down. In the fasting state, we can see that catabolism for energy is going to produce some large quantities of nitrogen because we just need that carbon skeleton for the TCA cycle and electron transport chain. So nitrogen is taken off of the amino acids and then converted to urea and excreted through the urine. And then we see some additional gluconeogenesis in the liver and in the kidneys as well. So when we take a look at the system integration and homeostasis, we have some regulatory systems that, again, we'll be talking a little bit more about in later chapters. And these include the nervous system, endocrine system, and vascular system. Now I'm going to go a little bit further into the endocrine system in this chapter, but we'll come back to these other systems in other chapters as well. So in the fed state, the endocrine system is going to promote digestion and absorption and, placing of nutrients in cells so they can either perform catabolic or anabolic functions. So we have GIP, CCK, gastrin, and secretin all involved in digestion of the energy providing nutrients. And then we have insulin, which is going to bind to insulin receptors on insulin dependent cells and allow glucose to enter those cells. And then we can see that endocrine function in the post-absorptive state. Then once we are in the post-absorptive or fasting state, insulin levels will drop and blood glucose will drop, and glucagon will be secreted from the liver in order to maintain blood glucose. We also will have epinephrine and norepinephrine stimulating stress in that fasted state, and insulin levels will be very low in this state as well. Now, we can use that to our advantage. So when we're looking at this post-absorptive or fasted state, we can use that to our advantage when we look at people who have metabolic symptoms, which are a cluster of risk factors for cardiovascular disease that include insulin resistance. So if a tiny bit of weight is lost, so if there's some restriction in nutrients creating, a post-absorptive or fasted state or increase in exercise, which will produce somewhat of a similar state, we can see that weight loss will occur and then increased insulin sensitivity will occur. So that insulin resistance will decrease and insulin sensitivity will increase. And when we look at sport nutrition, we can see that very similarly to regular metabolism in the fed and fasted state, we have energy for physical activity that comes from carbohydrate, protein, and fat as well. And energy demands during physical exertion in athletes are going to be similar to that fed-fast cycle, but just in a more severe way. When we look at the amount of calories or amount of energy being used in a catabolic sense, and maybe the goals of athletes to create new structures through creating muscle in an anabolic state, we can see that those energy demands can increase, even 5 or 6-fold. So when we look at the assessment of physical exertion, there are 3 different types of muscle. Now, type 1 is going to be red muscle. It's highly dense in mitochondria and highly oxidative. So this is going to be our slow twitch muscle fiber. Type 2A and 2B are considered our fast twitch muscle fibers. Type 2A is a hybrid of type 1 and 2B, and then type 2B has much fewer mitochondria and is very highly glycolytic. So this is going to be, our very fast twitch, no oxygen used, just carbohydrate dependent muscle fiber. We can measure, the amount of our types of muscle fibers as well as our fitness using the respiratory quotient as well as VO2 max tests to see what is our maximum oxygen uptake at a very high level of exertion. And when we look at energy sources during exercise, we can see that there are three main sources. We have the ATP creatine phosphate or phosphagen system. Muscles are going to use high energy creatine phosphate with ATP to perform, let's give an example, as a 1 rep max in a deadlift or something like that. We have the lactic acid system, which is going to be fueled by anaerobic glycolysis. This is going to be our 400-meter sprint sort of energy system. And then we have our aerobic system, which is our, long-term marathoner TCA cycle, highly oxidative, using in those mitochondria using lots of aerobic energy. And when we look at the energy sources during exercise, we can see that the sources are going to come from a variety of areas. So we have our muscle glycogen, which can be broken down. We have some plasma glucose, we have some plasma fatty acids, and we have some intramuscular trialkylglycerols as well. So we have all of these different sources that are going to help during exercise as the main function. So when we look at, an overview of what fuels are used during anaerobic and aerobic metabolism, we can see, the glucose can be used in anaerobic or aerobic metabolism, and amino acids and fatty acids, of course, are purely used for that aerobic metabolism. And these can come from different sources, right? They can come from our adipocytes or triglycerides stored in muscle for the fatty acids, body protein or dietary protein for amino acids, and blood glucose either from liver glycogen and gluconeogenesis in the liver, or dietary carbohydrate, or muscle glycogen that has been stored, from the day or two before. And when we look at, the energy sources during exercise, the lower intensity the exercise, the more fatty acids are used. And then as the intensity increases, we start to see increased carbohydrate use and lactate production. So with the lowest intensity plasma fatty acids, moderate increased fatty acid oxidation due to the use of those muscle triglycerides, and then the high intensity carbohydrate oxidation and lactate production. So taking a look at that, we can see here that, in high intensity activity, pure glucose is what's being used, whereas, when we're lying down, mostly fatty acids are being used. And then further here, you can see, that relationship between the creatine phosphate system, anaerobic metabolism of glucose, and aerobic metabolism of glucose as a function of different time frames of exercise as well. So as you can see, the longer term exercise, you're going to need to start getting some oxygen to your muscles in order to reduce the lactic acid accumulation. And the energy sources during exercise are going to be affected by a couple different things. So level of training, people who are highly trained can train at a much higher level related to their VO2 max or maximum oxygen consumption while performing, in the aerobic zone. And then also your initial glycogen levels are going to be determinants as well. So, a trained athlete can increase the amount of blood pumped with each heartbeat. So you can end up getting more blood delivered to that mitochondria, and mitochondrial density increases as well. There are some different regimens to incorporate, carbohydrate supercompensation or carb loading. A classic regimen is 2 sessions of intense exercise, 2 days of a low carb diet, and 3 days of a high carb diet. And lately people are using a more modified regimen of exercise tapered over 5 days and 1 day of rest, and then 3 days of a 50% carb diet, and then 3 days of a 70% high carbohydrate diet. And when we look at diets for exercise, there are a number of different things to take a look at, which we'll be talking about in our follow-up lecture.